COVID-19 claims 200,000 victims in Iran. The mullahs play with people's lives through their inhumane coronavirus policies. The novel coronavirus crisis and the mullahs' inhumane policies and inaction, including sending people to work where the virus is prevalent, refusing to pay the costs of a quarantine, and providing no prospect for a vaccine, have turned the people of Iran into the most vulnerable victims of this pandemic. The coronavirus illness has been a test for all governments. The mullahs have shown that not only are they indifferent to the health of the people, but even worse, they see this deadly virus as a blessing and an opportunity to extend their rule to the point that each day the death toll rises in Iran, surpassing the 200,000 threshold.
اما خیلی هم بزرگش نکنیم مسئله رو. یه قضیه ایست پیش آمده یک مدتی که انشالله خیلی طولانی نخواهد بود. این میتوانه دستاورد باشه.
From the outset, when the virus reached Iran, unlike other governments, Iran's regime failed to adopt standard procedures such as issuing an urgent alert, imposing quarantine measures, providing for the people's necessary provisions during quarantine, and increasing medical facilities to control the disease.
قرنطینه شهر ما نداریم اساساً و قرنطینه فردی است مال فردی که مشکوکه.
ما سیستم قرنطینه به گونه‌ای که قبلا مطرح بود رو امروز به عنوان یک کار 100% علمی نمیپذیریم.
Instead, its policy was to minimize the threat and cover up the realities. The regime put existing medical facilities at the disposal of regime leaders and their ilk.
حالا یه حادثه‌ای پیش میاد به هر حال از یک کشوری یک مصیبتی پیش آمده، یک ویروسی آمده، این ویروس هم الان حدود 40 تا کشور دنیا رو مبتلا کرده، همه جا رو مبتلا میکنه. این به هر حال یه جوری است که همه کشورها میره.
Under the guise of combating COVID-19, it sent the Revolutionary Guards and paramilitary Basij force onto the streets to create a militarized atmosphere in the cities. It continues to present a bogus death toll far below the real numbers. Another of the mullahs' treacherous policies has been to lie about the situation improving, a policy based on fear of popular protests. After 200,000 deaths, public demand for a viable vaccine is growing louder each day. Yet there are no signs that the authorities are dedicating a budget or adequately administrating the situation or even preparing the necessary resources. The regime's leaders resort to any excuse to justify their inaction, and officials even lay the blame on various obstacles in the way of purchasing and importing vaccines. As in the case of COVID-19, they have turned its vaccine into a political issue as well, which will only result in a rising death toll. The root of all the problems is the White House, said regime President Hassan Rouhani.
آدرس صحیح تمام جنایات و فشار بر مردم عزیز ایران واشنگتن دی سی کاخ سفید. این آدرسش.
Abdul Nasser Hemmati, head of Iran's central bank, also claimed on December 7th that U.S. sanctions do not permit the transfer of funds or the purchase of the vaccine through COVAX. Meanwhile, COVAX, the organization endorsed by the World Health Organization to distribute the vaccine, immediately responded that there was no legal barrier before Iran procuring vaccines through COVAX, as the U.S. Treasury Office on Foreign Assets Control had issued a license covering coronavirus vaccine procurement. Iran's state-controlled Aftab Yazdaily wrote on December 14th, regarding the coronavirus vaccine, officials have said that it is not possible to import foreign vaccines, but we are witnessing that vaccines have been imported from reliable countries and are being used by officials along with their children and associates. It is thus clear that the problem lies not in sanctions, the US, or bank transfers. Since the regime's supreme leader Ali Khamenei and Rouhani refused to use their billions of dollars to support Iran's people and the economy, there is no prospect of the crisis coming under control. Finally, Khamenei himself banned any imports of US and UK vaccines.
ورود واکسن آمریکایی و انگلیسی به کشور ممنوعه. این من به مسئولین هم گفتم، الانم به طور عمومی میگم. اینا اگر واکسن بلدن درست کنن، اگر کارخونه فایزرشون میتوانه واکسن درست کنه، چرا به ما میخوان بدن؟ خودشون مصرف کنن، اینقدر مرده و کشته زیاد نداشته باشن. انگلیس هم همینجور. به اینا بنابراین اعتمادم نیست. من واقعا اعتمادم ندارم. نمیدونم، گاهی اوقات هست اینا میخوان واکسن رو روی ملت‌های دیگه امتحان کنن ببینن اثر میکنه یا نمیکنه. بنابراین از آمریکا، از انگلیس، البته به فرانسه هم من خوشبین نیستم. واکسنی که برای کرونا آماده شد این مایه افتخاره، اینو انکار نکنن. تست انسانی شد و این واکسن رو درست کردن. انشالله بهترش و کاملترش رو هم درست خواهند کرد و روز به روز یعنی کاملتر خواهد شد. تا الان موفق بوده، بعد از این هم انشالله موفق خواهد بود.
The spokesperson of Iran's Red Crescent immediately followed suit and cancelled the import of 150,000 Pfizer vaccine doses on the verge of entering Iran. Iranian opposition NCRI President Maryam Rajavi described Khamenei's ban on importing US and UK vaccines as a deliberate massacre of the Iranian people. In reality, importing vaccines from trusted international companies would eliminate the huge profit that could otherwise be made by pharmaceutical cartels that are essentially run by the Revolutionary Guards. Thus, Iranian regime officials are hyping up a so-called domestic vaccine and are willing to pay its price with the lives of the Iranian people, even if the mullahs' policies cause the death toll to climb beyond the 200,000 mark. These are Iran's pharmaceutical companies, both manufacturers and distributors, that are essentially entities controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. Thus, it is clear that bogus claims such as sanctions, US restrictions, and restrictions on wire transfers are simply excuses to not import credible COVID-19 vaccines to vaccinate Iran's general public. They paved the path to sacrifice the Iranian people and crossing the 200,000 deaths threshold. All of this is so that the potential for profit by the Revolutionary Guard's pharmaceutical mafia does not disappear. In reality, Khamenei and Rouhani do not want to provide a vaccine unless they are forced to under pressure by the people. In the mullahs regime, all resources are first and foremost put at the disposal of the regime's security. If money is to be spent, it must be spent on suppression, censorship, and the regime's security, and to line the pockets of regime officials. Therefore, they make any excuse not to import the vaccine to Iran. The state-controlled Aftab-e-Yazd Daily wrote on December 8th, "A very important point is that if the Iranian government is unable to resolve the problem in the months ahead, it would have negative impacts among the population, because people will compare their society with others. Furthermore, public expectations have gone up. For 10 months, the regime benefited from the coronavirus to delay an uprising. Now the mullahs' mafia are using its vaccine to make sure that the people's attention and energy is not diverted from the coronavirus." Despite all the fanfare by the mullahs' president, Iran's people are both striving to save themselves from the coronavirus and struggling against poverty and destitution, which has been brought about by the mullahs' regime. The exponential rise in the death toll, which has surpassed 200,000, indicates that this crisis will continue. If the regime genuinely wanted to control the virus, it would have supported the nation financially like other countries so that people would remain under quarantine without concerns over how to provide food for their families. Overcrowding at workplaces, the metro, or shopping centers is a major cause of the spread of the virus. Although these circumstances have been forced upon the people by the mullahs regime, the reality is that this same nation brought about the November 2019 uprising. Thus, despite all the hardships, Iran's restive youth are determined to end their inhumane circumstances by rejecting the mullahs regime in its entirety. All the facts and the last 10 months of the coronavirus in Iran indicate that the mullahs regime neither wants to nor can bring the virus under control. Since Khamenei's number one priority is preserving his regime, he will use the nation's resources on nothing other than their nuclear weapons initiatives, advancing the regime's ballistic missile program, exporting terrorism, and funding his suppressive forces to control any uprising. In one word, he seeks only to maintain his detested religious dictatorship intact. Therefore, the only solution for ridding Iran of the coronavirus is to rid Iran of the mullahs regime.